You need to know your values, right? Understanding and clearly defining your core values is the first step to practicing integrity, right? Identifying the values that are like super important to you, most important to you. And when we talk about values, maybe asking like, what do you mean, Josh, values? What are you talking about? I'm talking about the things, the non-negotiables, right? The things that you're just like, man, I cannot, this is something that is truly and super duper important to me, and I'm going to ride on this one thing. That is what I'm talking about when I talk about core values, right? Those things that are super duper important to you, figuring out what those things are. And they're only going to be really a few of them. When you start to sift down and start to think about it, it's really only a few of them. And those core values will act as a guide for your actions and your decisions. Let me give you an example. So for me, right, we talked about the things that we're talking about are actually things that are actually core to me, right? So like authenticity, right? That is extremely important to me. I will, to my benefit, when it's to my benefit and when it's not to my benefit, right? I am willing to be authentic to myself. And that's kind of like my fence and my guidelines, even in the example that I used when I talked about the music producer and us not clashing with the right sound and being true to being like, no, that sound actually isn't me, right? Those are little things of just realizing like, man, I would rather be me than to pretend being something else. So authenticity is core to me as I navigate life and my friendships and my relationships and all of those things. That is a core pillar for me where it's just like, I've got to be authentic. Another one of my values is courage, right? So we talked about it again, courage to step up and speak up and say the thing, to say what I'm actually feeling in that moment. And I'm not saying that courage is a license to be rude or disrespectful or any of those things. But I think at the end of the day, in order for me to be authentic, I must also be courageous, right? There is no authenticity without the courage to speak up about the things that work for me and that don't work for me, right? And it all comes together with integrity also, one of my core values, which is integrity, which is just like, man, win, lose, or draw, right? If it's the right thing, we're going to do the right thing. If it is a value, we're going to the best of my ability, I'm going to try to continue that value and hold fast to whatever that line is. And listen, I don't always get it right? I don't always, and there's times where it's like, man, like I want this to be happening, but this is not happening. And it feels like someone is maybe stepping on my core value, or I didn't respect my core value. But that's why they're there for, because once I feel that, then I realize like, okay, I need to reroute. Something is wrong here. Something's off here, right? So those are core values, but how can you start to learn what your core values are? I want you to think about this. Someone once gave me this exercise, and I thought it was super helpful in starting to think about what your core values are. Think about the things that offend you. Like bear with me right now. Think about the things that like really, really get under your skin. Like really get under your skin. Right? Let me give you some examples of what that might be. I sometimes may or may not, I cannot confirm this, but my wife at times sometimes says that I can potentially have a smidgen, just a small bit of road rage sometimes. Sometimes I can, when someone's on the road and they do something and it's not wise, I get very irritated by it. And it's just like a visceral reaction. It's just a reaction to it, right? It's just like, what are you doing, right? And one can say when you start to dig at that thing that offends me, what it really offends me is the fact that they are incompetent, right? It feels like they are incompetent. They're doing something and they are not competent in what they're doing. So one of the things, again, outside of our core values, there are other things that are important to us. But like one of the things for me is like competence. And you can see that in the way somebody drives, and you can see that in the way when I'm working with somebody or whatever the case may be. I want you to at least come to the table and be competent in that thing. Like if we're sitting at the same table, we're about to attack the thing, let's be competent in it. And if you're not competent, at least be teachable. Right? At least be teachable, and then we can figure the thing out. But like if you're not teachable and you're not competent, it's going to be very hard for me to interact with you. I'm just telling you right now, it's going to be very hard for me to interact with you, right? Another example is just like someone who lacks empathy, right? Somebody who lacks empathy. For me, that's a offender for me. That's a offender. When I say empathy, what I mean is like someone where you're sharing something and they can't sit in that moment with you and just be. They will either make it about them, or they will either minimize what you're trying to say, or they will either try to deflect what you're trying to say. But they cannot just be. They cannot hear news and just sit in that moment with you, right? That to me is a offender of mine, right? You can have a whole bunch of different offenders, but that's why I want you to kind of think about what are some things that offend you? What are the things that offend you, and how can you start to correlate those things to what core values, right? Some of us may have intolerance for diversity, right? Like, man, like if there isn't inclusion, and that can just lead towards like inclusion, right? We want people to be inclusion. We want people to be included. We want things to be diverse. We want like that is a value of some people. So, as we kind of navigate all of this and starting to practice integrity, one of the ways that we can practice integrity is knowing what our values are, because as we know what our values, that becomes the guidelines for a lot of the things, right? And when we understand and clearly define what our core values, that is the first step for us to start practicing integrity.